Sure. Okay, so my name is Alex Moknatsky. I am a PhD student. A PhD candidate. I study social movements, but my focus is on digital social movements. So I look at particularly around contentious action or contentious politics around copyright and intellectual property law. So in terms of the Quebec's student strike, I've been kind of observing it kind of a very curious social scientific way observing. But it's not actually my field. But
what are some preliminary observations?
Okay. Well, I was talking to Nicole, and I think really where what I find really interesting is the depiction of the movement by the mainstream media. I think it's really interesting just how the mainstream Anglo media has seen the movement because they've read it in a particular way. And how I would say they've read it is really they've emphasized three factors. They've said that, this strike, what it's really about is that it's all about entitlement. It's about, that Quebec society and particularly youth have been very entitled. And that has been basically the motivation for why people are protesting, is because now the jig is up. The fact is that the province has to pull back the nannies. So I should preface this that the people I'm talking about in terms of voices in the mainstream Anglo media would be, for instance, Barbara Kay, Margaret Wente, who else? Rosie DiMano, and anyone who's written in the Montreal Gazette. If you read any op-eds in the Montreal Gazette, they all have the same thing. So the issues are that it's about entitlement, that it's really meaningless. It's really just about kids wanting to act out. It's about the excitement of the protest. And third, that really it's completely irrational because people just need to, get with the game. The fact is that tuition, post-secondary education is much more costly, and we need to raise tuition. And the three problems with that is that, this issue has not been about, it's not just the fact that Quebec is entitled. It's that we really need to look at power. And the fact is that student unions in Quebec have been traditionally much more powerful vis-a-vis the rest of Canada. Like I was an undergrad at the University of Toronto in the early part, just at the turn of the century, 2001, 2004. And, in Ontario, the same thing was going on. They were raising tuitions. And there was a protest, and there was a tuition freeze, but it was short-lived. Why? Because the student unions in Ontario are not as strong and is not as cohesive as you have here in Quebec. Not only are the student unions really strong and cohesive here, but also the CSN is, and I'm really poor with my French, but it's the Confédération de, can anyone help me out here? The Syndicate National. Okay. I have to double check that one, the CSN, but they are, just a really well organized bureaucratic union that's very powerful. And so the reason why, tuitions have remained so low for so long in Quebec has been because, well, the provincial government has been scared of offending the student unions because they know that there was always a potential for powerful, strong mobilization to take place. So really, it's not about entitlement. It's not just about youth and students having been provided by the nanny state and now it's being taken away and they're getting angry. It's because students have been traditionally very powerful here and they've been very good at securing their interests. So that's the first problem. The second thing is about this, that's really, and there's an Andrew Coyne article last week that really emphasizes this, is this idea that this is all about the excitement of getting people involved and, dressing up and going naked in the streets and running around and all that, and it's nothing beyond that. And Barbara Kay, the phrase, and I talked about it in class yesterday, the mindless mobs, right? Seeing this protest is all about mindless mobs. And this is a popular way of looking at protest, that it's all about emotion, it's about that, related to entitlement. Margaret Wente said that Quebec is like the Greeks of Canada. Mm-hmm. And so it's the same sort of thing, that it's, people go to the streets because it's about emotion and they're angry. And here, it's not just about that. It's not just about anger and emotion, but it's also about the excitement and the fact that we get to bang pots and pans, and it's a party. And the real problem with that, the real issue, is that parties don't work very well as social movements. Mm-hmm. A rave can only last a couple days, and then people get tired unless they have real interests in the issues going on. And so what I would say is, in terms of the large mobilization that you're seeing, the large number of students that are participating, sure. A lot of people are joining the protests. When you have 200,000 people, a lot of people are participating because they want to feel part of a collective enterprise. They want to feel part of something bigger. But you can't have that happening. You can't have that taking place and lasting so long unless you are really, unless you have the organization there, and unless you're very strategic in what types of protests and what types of tactics, what types of collective action you're going to pursue. And the other thing about this movement, or the protests, again, the student strike, has been that it's been very successful in the strategies it's chosen, for the most part. I think the best example is the last large-scale march that we had here, when we had 400,000 students to protest Bill 78, and you saw a strategic decision right in the middle of that protest, where one group of students wanted to disobey the planned route. They had given the planned route to the police, and they wanted to disobey that. So you had this break where you had some students who followed the planned route, and then other students who broke away from that planned route as sort of a way to signify, to make a claim against the repressiveness of that law. And I thought that was a really interesting and symbolic, move. So I think that basically, so that's the second problem, is it's not about mindlessness. It's really been well thought out for the most part, been very well, strategic. And then the third thing is this, and this is my favorite, the get with the program logic, where it's like, well, look, Quebec has the lowest tuition compared to the rest of Canada. The rest of the world, you're seeing increased tuition rates. The rest of Canada is paying a fair share. Why aren't Quebec students paying a fair share? They need to get with the program. This is the real world. And they really emphasize that we're talking about a piddling amount of money here. We're talking about, that's what they say, we're really talking about a couple of bucks over a week, and it amounts to around $1,500 over 5 years. But we're really talking about small amounts. So, you've got to get with the program. Everyone else is raising tuition. Why don't you raise tuition here? And what's never mentioned in the mainstream press, mainstream Anglo press, is the alternative. The idea that you could raise income tax. That would be a way to help pay for increased costs of post-secondary education. And I think that not acknowledging, because that claim has been pretty central to the student movement, not acknowledging that claim in the mainstream Anglo press has helped shape this depiction by people outside of Quebec, like my mother, for instance, that just sees this as a completely, it doesn't make any sense. It really does not make any sense, because the alternatives have not been presented to people who are watching from the outside. So I've really found that I've been really surprised by just how cohesive the views are of the mainstream press outside of Quebec. And it's startling, actually. So that would be basically my observations in terms of looking at, for instance, press coverage. I don't know where else I should go in terms of my rambling.
Barbara Kay, she recently wrote something about how this is more of a French-speaking movement. Can you elaborate on that and your opinions on that?
Well, that again goes into the idea that it's about the distinctive nature of Quebec, and that it's because she does say that it's partial. It is about English-French divides, but then she also makes a real connection between that. It's because the French connection is to the nanny state, right? Francophone Quebecers are overly comfortable with how that the state provides. The state has a large role, for instance, in the economy, and the state should provide everything for them. And I think that was one element of Kay's article, is really to make the connection between the English language divide as a cultural divide. And otherwise, I think in terms of thinking the English-French divide, she made a real point that McGill the Student Association did not, the referendum to join the strike, it failed. And so McGill's not part of the student strike. And I think that is not because of an English-French divide so much as in terms of looking at the student body of McGill and the fact that we have a large component of students who come from outside of McGill and also internationally. And generally, this campus has been very conservative. It's known. But I don't have too much other to say in terms of thinking about the English-French divide. I know in terms of my own participation in various protests that it's clear that one of the difficulties is that French and English students don't necessarily converse when we're all in the same crowds, and that when you see protests in particular neighborhoods, that they've been dominated by the language of that neighborhood. So I live in the Mile End, which is it's primarily Anglo. There's a large Anglo population in the Mile End, and the Pots and Pans protest, at least on my street, everyone's speaking English, right? Now I haven't had a chance to see the Pots and Pans protests in other places, but you might see that there would be similar things. So yeah.
How? I think you said you were a social movement teacher, or?
Yeah, well, I guess I am a teacher, but I'm not a professor
yet
because I haven't got my PhD.
How would you see? What means would you see effective to fight the tuition increases that the students in the public can take?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What would be effective means to fight the tuition increases?
That's interesting. I am not the best strategist. And I know that the reason why I know that I'm not the best strategist is because I thought it was a real mistake when the students rejected the offer. I guess it was 3 weeks ago. And I said, oh man, what a mistake. Because, although I'm very sympathetic to the movement, I just thought you can only have protests for so long before people just get tired of them. And I thought that was going to mean that the protests were going to significantly weaken, and the popularity public support of the protests was going to decline. And I think they did a little bit, but then of course Charest made the blunder of the year when he decided to bring in Bill 78, which was, I think, in terms of your question was, what's the best way to oppose? And really, sometimes the best way to oppose is to let your opponent make the mistake. And I think that was what happened. Really, what happened here is that because Charest just basically opened the door. And the big thing that happened with Bill 78 is that it allowed student activists to reframe what this was all about. And it no longer became just about tuition. It no longer became about the specific interests of students, but it became a much more important and broader question. I wouldn't say important, but much more broader question about, how do you express dissent in society, and how, what rights do we have to express dissent with, our government? And there's a great column in the Gazette a couple days ago by my colleague in political science, Theo McLaughlin, and he's a conservative, and he wasn't really supporting the strike, but he wrote this column, and he basically said, with Bill 78, you've turned me. I'm now, I was actually a green square, and now I'm not a green square. I don't know if I'm a red square, but I'm going to be on the streets because I do not like Bill 78. So you have really seen, and that's, the pots and pans, that didn't happen until there was Bill 78. And one last observation about the pots and pans relative to the media is that when that first happened in the national press, a lot of the depictions of the pots and pans, they first called the so-called pots and pans, or the so-called casserole protest, and they didn't just say so-called, they also had to add the quotation marks around casserole to really emphasize that, this is not really all that important. It doesn't really have any meaning. And then the second thing that when the early descriptions of the casserole protests were that it's primarily the mothers of students who are protesting. So it's people who have interest, or university profs. So it's either university profs or it's mothers who are joining in with the casserole protests. It's not the broader community, right? And that has been something, because if you go out and watch, and it varies from neighborhood to neighborhood, but when you see it take place in particular neighborhoods, you see that there's a broad community support for this movement. My whole street, basically, except with the exception of my neighbor, because my upstairs neighbor hates the pots and pans protests, so she'll put out her amp and play really loud distortion to try to dim out the protest. And she also, where I realized that she might have gone off the edge a little bit, is there was a couple of people walking down the street banging pots and pans, and she turned to them and said, fuck you, shut the fuck up. And then the people that were walking down the street were revealed as, away from the tree shading, and it was like two 7-year-olds banging, and we were just like, wow. And yesterday she got into a screaming fit that almost ended in the police being called with people on my street. So, but generally the great thing about the pots and pans protest is it's diffused to an extent a little bit of the tensions, because it's become sort of a more enjoyable expression of dissent. And I think it's been an absolutely lovely thing to witness. As someone who is not from Quebec and is recently moved to Montreal, relatively recently moved to Montreal, I have never seen this in Canada. So I think it's a wonderful thing to witness.